All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. My name's Deb Dutcher. I'm the Library Services Consultant at the New Hampshire State Library. This is my grandson, Easton. And I'm here to introduce our next speaker, the author of Screenwise, Helping Kids Thrive and Survive in Their Digital World, and Growing Up in Public, Coming of Age in a Digital World, which we have distributed a whole bunch of your books all over New England, Devorah.
Awesome.
And I also want to thank you for working with us. But this was something that was supposed to happen like last spring, and it just didn't. And I said, "Well, do you think you could do the Teen Summit this fall?" And she was like, "Sure." So thank you very much. So I'm going to turn it right over to you. Okay.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much. It's my pleasure to be with librarians and other folks who care about access to information and stories, and people who are supporting young adults in communities. I think this is a really crucial time for young adults to have as many spaces as possible that are supportive and welcoming and can offer all kinds of access to media literacy, and stories and community. And so this is a really crucial time, and all the work that you all do is very important. And as you know, since some of you have read Growing Up in Public or had a look at it, I am a really passionate advocate for young people, and I think it's really important to hear their voices. And there's a lot of conversations right now going on around young people and social media that is more on a restrictive approach and less on a mentoring approach. So there's this idea like we need to put warning labels on social media. Australia has just um, worked toward legislation that would potentially keep young people off social media until 16. School districts and states are suing companies like Meta and TikTok. And to be clear, I'm not saying that as a parent of a 15-year-old, as an educator, as an advocate for young people, trust big tech to take care of our kids. I'm not saying that at all, but I also think an approach that focuses mostly on restriction and age gating is really missing an opportunity. And my work is really focused on how can we mentor kids to thrive in the digital world. And this is not to say, of course, that we should be handing over powerful communication devices to 8-year-olds and kind of walking away and seeing how it goes. That's not what I'm saying. But I do think that when we only focus on age gating and restriction, we really miss the opportunity to mentor young people. And it doesn't further the goals of media literacy. And it also is, unfortunately, a way, I think, to silence young voices and youth activists. So what I do is I research kids in their habitat. I actually talk to kids in schools and other settings, sometimes in libraries, about their experiences of growing up in the digital world, growing up with their parents, potentially sharing images of them on social media, growing up with fan culture on YouTube or TikTok or other spaces, growing up with gaming and Discord. I also cite a lot of other research. Like I'm an individual, I'm no longer at a university. I was at DePaul and at Lake Forest, so I have been in those settings, but and before that at Northwestern for graduate school. But I can't do, a big study with 5,000 or 50,000 people. So I just wanted to share some resources for those of you who are like, I want to know more about kids and digital media, and I don't necessarily trust the people who say the sky is falling, but their research maybe has some issues. So I want to look at some other sources. The Pew Center for Internet and American Life is really great. There's also a lab out of the University of North Carolina, the Developmental Social Neuroscience Lab. And then the London School of Economics Digital Futures for Children also does a lot of great international research. Now, it's true that kids in the UK in particular have right now more privacy rights, for example, than US kids. But overall, all of these spaces are really good to look at. And I think we're seeing the landscape shift actually with this Australia rule. Canada is also looking at potentially some different rules around social media. So I think we're going to see this landscape shift. So any of these sources could be good to keep an eye on just to understand like what do researchers even think? And of course, a lot of the questions parents ask me when I'm directly out at schools, we can't exactly answer. Like if you want to know what is it like to be an adult who grew up on TikTok, like we can't really answer that yet, right? Or there's just other questions that we don't know the answers to. But I think it's really important that we resist generational generalities, and especially a kind of a sky is falling, what's wrong with this generation kind of approach. And I think in libraries is one of the places where I've seen really positive uses of technology, whether it's a Minecraft server, whether it's kids coming together to, create videos about the books that they love and sharing them in social spaces online. Um, these are incredibly important spaces for kids to learn how to use and ideally to be empowered to use in ways that are affirming and age appropriate and thoughtful. And I think a lot of that work can happen in libraries and, kind of library adjacent spaces. So, but it's great to have access to this research. As we mentor kids growing up in the digital age, we're thinking about what are their social skills? What are their conflict resolution skills? How are they going to navigate reputation in a world where any of us can go viral for the right or wrong reasons? And this is something that I especially think about having written growing up in public, the idea that kids are vulnerable to having something shared about them or of them, or that they themselves have shared, but having it go out of context, having it become potentially something that is really damaging in the extreme on the bad side. On what kids would say maybe is the positive side is there's always the opportunity to go viral, for something cool, but that also has some risks, especially for young people. So we can talk more about that, and I'm happy to take questions. But it's really important to kind of think about what it is to grow up searchable, and that's a very different experience than many of us had, even those of you who are, you know, um, in the sort of decade coming out of college, who your experiences as a young person are more recent than mine. The digital world, even that someone grew up with who is, say, now in their late 20s, is still a different digital world than these kids grew up with. So it's a rapidly moving set of opportunities and challenges. And finally, self-esteem. How do we navigate self-esteem when kids can quantify their following? Kids can quantify how many people like their photo as opposed to their friends' photos, right? We're all in a situation where we can do that. Our library can quantify our followings. We've all seen some librarians who've gone pretty viral on TikTok or Instagram, which is an opportunity, right, for your voices to be heard in the world. But does that create a world where there's also some pressure where, we feel like we have to do the cool thing and have some kind of, amazing sort of fan conversation? Do we have to have a ton of fans, right? If you have a channel and 100 people follow it, but it's incredibly valuable to those 100 people, is your colleague who has 100,000 followers or 10,000 followers like doing a better job, right? Or do you have different priorities? Some of us only want to serve the people we see in person, and some of us have also recognized that social media can have challenges for our own mental health, and we're taking a step back, right? And so how does self-esteem for the young people we support kind of get triggered in different ways, get supported in different ways, but also sometimes get harmed in different ways in this world of social media? And what can we do to create communities where young people matter outside of these metrics? And it's really important to give young people context. And there's also some great stories and books about the ways social media matters to young people that we can talk about. We want to give kids opportunities to practice self-regulation when they're using tech. Sometimes we literally need to remind them when they're using tech in certain ways in public spaces, like if some of you maybe have spaces where gaming is allowed or even encouraged in the library, but what kind of conversation can accompany gaming? And are there some limits to that kind of conversation? Is there limits to just the volume of conversation? What does it all look like? And again, we know kids are growing up in these communities. A lot of times parents, when I speak in schools specifically, will say, oh, we're waiting until X age for a phone. And I'm like, oh, what's your kid doing right now? And they're like, oh, they're on a public server playing Roblox, right? So in other words, parents don't always, like, sometimes, especially parents of kids growing up right now, really essentialize certain milestones of growing up in the digital age that were very big for them. Like any adult my age or older, or really even in their 30s, because I'm in my 40s, would remember their first phone as a milestone of communication, right? If you're in your 20s or younger, maybe you grew up with a phone. But for those of us who didn't grow up with phones, say in middle school, or high school even, to have a mobile phone really changed our communication capacity and our experience of communication. For kids growing up now, getting a phone may be less of a big deal than parents might imagine, because if you're on a public server in second grade, group texting your class on Google Hangouts and playing Roblox on a public server, that's going to be a very different situation. It's not that the phone doesn't still change at a new dimension when you get to, say, middle school and you get that phone, but it may not be as kind of big deal as parents imagine. And unfortunately, a lot of parents especially are waiting to mentor their kids on digital issues like social skills and getting along and empathy for others until they get a phone, not really thinking about the many ways young people are interacting online before that. Now, that said, a phone and certainly access to social media, which tends to more come into play in the tween and teen years, certainly is an additional set of cultures to learn, of etiquette to learn, et cetera. Right? We know kids are growing up with a digital footprint, which means that, again, their parents may be sharing them, and then as they get older, they may be sharing themselves. I thought it was really important the ways Cara was talking about that when she was a teacher, she had boundaries about what she felt like she could talk about and not talk about. Similarly, for those of you working with young people in a library setting, if someone did show you a post that they or someone else made, there's all kinds of questions, legal, emotional, right? Boundary wise, like when would you say to a young person, I don't really want to see that. You can tell me about your experience, but I don't want to see the post, right? Are there situations where it's better for you not to have seen it? It gets really complicated. For those who work more directly in mental health, like mental health professionals, counselors, psychologists, therapists, kids are bringing their phones and screenshots of what other people have said into sessions, right? And that again gets like very complicated. Now, when we talk to young people about reputation, I think it's really important, and I was so glad someone brought up Accountable. I have a slide of the cover of that book later, and I know Dashka Slater, the author of Accountable, I really appreciate that book. So I definitely want to circle back to that. When we talk to young people about reputation, we want to lean into the conversation about character and not just the threat of consequences. And this is where I think libraries are in a different position than schools. Schools often, because of the nature of school, because school is compulsory, for many reasons, tend to really lean into a very consequences, is sort of a punitive kind of conversation around reputation. And I think working with young people in a different setting, and I guess some of you may be also at schools, and so this, like it gets really tricky at schools because we have to, sometimes report things. We can't just kind of talk to kids about them and let it go, right? But when kids are talking about reputation, a lot of what they've heard from the adults in their lives, parents, teachers especially, is if you do that, if you post that, you won't get into whatever, you won't be able to go to the University of Vermont on a full scholarship. You won't be able to go to Dartmouth or Harvard or whatever. And the focus can be, especially when you see these high profile cases every once in a while of kids who are rescinded, who have their admission rescinded or revoked from schools because of something that's been posted, either that they themselves have posted or that someone's posted about them in some cases, or, images or video of them, that we get really focused on those consequences. And when we lead with those consequences, when we talk to kids about digital reputation, we're making a really grave error, because then we're focusing with kids and teaching them not to get caught. The message is, if you say you won't get into Princeton if you post that, what you're actually saying to a young adult is don't get caught, right? What we want to emphasize with young people in the digital age is do no harm. If you're not sure why that meme is funny, do not share it. Do not like it. Do not vote for it with a little thumbs up, right? If you think that that screenshot is harmful, don't share it. If that nude image that's going around school, which violates someone's privacy, which is potentially illegal for you to share, is, whether or not you know the person who's in the photo, or even if you have no idea who they are, don't share it. Don't have it on your phone, right? Not because of the law, which is important too, not because you might get caught and not be able to go to Princeton if you share that unkind joke, or worse, something that is racist, homophobic, misogynist, xenophobic. But because you are making yourself a less safe person to be around by voting for that meme with a thumbs up, by sharing something harmful, someone in your life, or maybe many people in your life, now feel less safe around you. You've put yourself in a situation where you're promulgating harm and promoting harm, and you don't want to do that. And most kids actually don't want to do that, right? It gets a little different when somebody gets aligned with hate in a way where they do want to do it. That's a little bit of a different scenario. But many kids are in a more ambivalent space that end up doing things that are quite harmful online, right? Some kids truly do harmful things without any negative intent or very minimal negative intent. There's a huge range of things that can happen. And then there's a lot of people in that messy middle. Like, I wanted to do something outrageous. I wanted to get a rise out of people. I wanted someone to finally notice me and notice my posts, but they don't necessarily have extremely harmful intentions. And then there are, again, kids who may have been cultivated down all the way down the road of extremely harmful intentions. But when we lead with consequences, again, we're just telling those kids to go on the dark web. We're telling those kids to post anonymously. We're not really getting into the harm, and the harm is what we want to prevent. And also, most kids don't get caught. So we also lose a lot of credibility because many kids are walking around at Dartmouth and Harvard having done harmful things. So it's also like not true when we say like, if you do this, you'll definitely get caught and experience this consequence. So it's not a reason not to do it, right? It's very important. And many kids we talk to in the library, maybe on the other side, may have experienced being targeted, may have experienced someone at school or someone in the community posting something that's harmful toward them. And so we also need to let kids know, what are their options in those situations? What are their options if they know the perpetrator, if they don't know the perpetrator? What are choices they can make around their own social media that might make them feel safer if they do feel targeted directly or indirectly? Young people often forget who the audience is for their posts, so it's important for them to think about that. It's also important for them to think about their privacy settings, right? So something like Snapchat, where, the default is to share your location with a bunch of people, is something to really think about. I think many people right now are in a new level of reckoning around privacy because the privacy practices of big tech have become, I think we can all, say maybe like notoriously not on our side, not user friendly. And so something like Snapchat maps, and again, um, everyone's experience may vary, but for me, Snapchat maps, for example, can make me feel bad, make me feel left out. It reveals my location. And one of the conversations I had with my own 15-year-old is, even if you don't feel like revealing your personal location creates a safety risk for you, your location is also potentially revealing other people's location. Like, people might know who your friends are. You don't know all of your friends' situations related to being documented for immigration. You don't know all your friends' situations in relationship to relationship violence or a custody situation between their parents, right? You don't know everything about everyone else's safety. And so by you revealing your location, you could be making someone else less safe. And that was the thing that, I also talked to my kid about the fact that I think from a relationship perspective, when we see other people on the Snapchat map, we can feel really bad. It can make us feel bad. It can make us feel left out. But the way that I was able to persuade him to not share his location was that conversation about the safety of others. And it was kind of a light bulb moment for him of like, oh, we're all creating these data trails, and we have to think not just about our own safety, but other people's safety. Right. So that was an important conversation. And I think these are conversations we can have with kids, because the people who say kids don't care about privacy have not been talking to teenagers, I believe, right? Kids may share things that surprise us. And I wrote an article last year for Washington Post about the fact that kids often will come out online about neurodiversity, around queer identity, around other issues that previous generations may be surprised about or feel like, I can't believe they're sharing that. That's taboo, right? So that's a big generational conflict right now that we're seeing, that kids are often more open about these aspects of their identity, and doing so in a digital space makes some adults really nervous. So some adults then come away with the idea that kids don't care about privacy, but they do care about privacy. They may just think very, very differently about privacy. They also may use technologies in ways that are surprising. You may find that They're using your library Wi-Fi in a way that's surprising. You may find that, in schools, the use of Google Hangouts and Google Classroom is often not what schools expect and appreciate. But I think it's really important that we take a moment to think about how savvy and smart kids are and how creative. There's a lot of surveillance in kids' lives right now. There is the sort of self and peer surveillance of something like a Snapchat Maps. There's schools have these grading apps where their parents can see, like, I have a 15-year-old again. I can see if my kid was 2 minutes late to class. I can see how he did on every little quiz. When I was in high school, I'm not sure my parents even knew the order of my classes or what I had, first versus third period. The level of data that they were getting in the early 90s about my high school experience was much, much lower. If I didn't show up for a couple of days, school might have called home. Certainly, if I failed a class, I think they would have heard from somebody. If I was not going to graduate, right? But the sort of micro level of data that parents get was not an open book for adults at that time, and in many previous generations. And so the changes to relationships and families because of this is huge. And then there's also the possibility to geo-track kids. So kids are both geo-tracking each other on things like Snapchat and Find My Phone, but then parents are geo-tracking kids. And it's really important to think about those dynamics. And the library, again, is a space that I use as an example for parents. Like, yeah, you can geo-track your kid and see that they're in the library. Are they in the library bathroom? Are they in a study room studying for, AP US history? Are they behind the library vaping? Like, really no. Tracking your kid gives you physical data about where their phone is, right? Unless your kid knows how to change that data, which some kids do, or unless they have a friend literally take their phone, to the library or some other space. But it's very important to understand these dynamics, these tracking dynamics that are going on as you serve families as well as kids, right? It's really important to understand. And to be fair to parents, because I don't want to throw these parents under the bus. These are parents who've been through the pandemic. They've been through a lot of anxiety-provoking situations. They've seen school shootings on the news or even had them happen in their own community. There's tremendous anxiety in being a parent right now. And also, I will say, as a parent who doesn't remember my own early childhood very well, but you do mostly remember being a teenager, I think being a parent of a teenager comes with those special experiences of like remembering all the dumb things you did and the risks that you took, some of which are inherent to that developmental stage. And so the feeling of like to be a good parent would be surveillance can seem very logical to a lot of parents, and they don't necessarily see the ways that they're intervening with their kids' emerging independence, their kids' emerging executive function skills, and even their sense of just efficacy. So I think that's really important. We know that young people are navigating a lot of distraction in the digital age. If there are opportunities, like if you run study groups or if you're in a space where you're supporting young people and they're interested in that kind of support, or if your library actually runs any kind of more formal like tutoring or study support programs, it's really interesting to talk to kids about the research around digital distraction, that putting your phone out of sight really does make a difference. Closing windows on your computer does make a difference. I think of myself as something of an expert in this area, having written a couple of books about it. And even so, I saw my kid the other day really, really struggling with a research project. And I realized he had about 60 windows open on the computer, and it had never occurred to him that he could print out a few of the sources and, or take notes on a few of the sources and put them on paper and not be trying to toggle back and forth between his writing window. And this is like on a tiny little Chromebook and like 60 sources. So this isn't even like when I write my books, I have my big, big monitor, but this was like this tiny little screen. And I just thought this is making it much harder. But of course, he's 15, so he was like, whatever, you're wrong. But I was like, okay, at least I have insight on why this is hard and why this is taking so long. So these are things we can share. And sometimes in a library setting, there's an opportunity to just give kids an opportunity to experiment. Like, what does work for you? Does it help to have headphones? Does it help to study socially? Does it help to go into a room by yourself for some topics? Right? Okay, these are apps that kids I worked with at schools have developed and shared. And when I say apps they've developed, I mean like they ideated, around the idea of the app and drew a picture. They didn't actually build these apps, but this is one to prevent peers from taking screenshots of what they've shared, which gives you a sense of how much they actually do care about privacy. right? They don't want young people, other friends taking screenshots of what they've shared. They do have boundaries. Their boundaries, again, are very different. And there's a whole bunch about these boundaries and growing up in public about, again, the ways young people are sharing about their identities, and especially around neurodiversity, queerness, and sexuality and gender identity, and also around survivorship experiences. I think it's really important to understand that young people are claiming those experiences, claiming those identities in public spaces in new ways. And there's an opportunity, I think, to have conversations in affinity-based groups and in affirming groups in library settings for kids to really explore what that means, to also explore what are some of the risks. Like, absolutely, there are some risks in going on, mental health Discord to get your mental health information. So I'm not here, again, to say this is all perfect and wonderful. I think there's a lot of amazing spaces that are really great for kids online. And I think it's really important if you have someone in your life, to say to you, okay, but if you're in a mixed age space and you're 14 years old, can you also access mental health information, mental health support by a licensed practitioner in your own community, at school or in the community, right? Like you don't want to only be getting affirmation and support online. And so what can we do to help kids recognize that maybe what they were reaching out into a Discord community for, or reaching out in the comments on TikTok for, or following someone on YouTube for, there may be access to important set support and affinity and groups in their own community that might be able to support them in a really different way than they can get online, right? So I think it's important to not be sort of either or about it. It's also important to understand that young people are taking leadership roles and being moderators in online communities, but in ways that also exposes young people potentially to risks of their own. So I talked to a young person for growing up in public who was a moderator in a Discord server that was a fan server about Schitt's Creek, but she was in the Girl Talk server, like a or sub server, and her conversations with people in that in the Girl Talk community were, not predominantly about mental health, but did include mental health to the point where she was supposed to respond and support people if they were crying out for help, if they mentioned suicidal ideation or self-harm, and give them resources. Well, this is a 13-year-old eighth grader. And one of the things I wanted to know is, do the grown-ups in your life know that you're playing this role and that these are the kinds of things that are coming up? Right? Like, I don't think 13 is too young to have conversations about mental health or potentially to do peer support. But I do think it's too young to be doing those things totally independently without someone supporting her, right? Like, someone in her life needs to know that she's doing that and to be supporting her and making sure it's really okay with her to be in that role. Um, and I think that's where you see a lot of, again, generational breakdown sometimes, where like her parents knew she was using Discord, but they didn't really know what it was or what the conversations were about or what it was like, right? And when a kid says, I'm spending a lot of time on YouTube or TikTok or Discord, that's like saying I'm spending a lot of time in Chicago for me. Like, what does that mean? Like, where am I going in Chicago? Who am I hanging out with? What experiences am I having? Is it, 3 a.m. or, 2 in the afternoon? Am I going with a friend that I trust? Have I got a map with me? Right? And so it's important to understand a little bit of nuance. And especially when we're talking about mental health, I do think there's a role to play, again, especially in the neurodiverse community, for claiming self-diagnosis. And I think in the adult community, there's been a lot of really good conversations around self-diagnosis that I don't want to like veer us off down that path. But I think when you're talking to a kid and they're self-diagnosing, I would hope that they would also try to tap into some resources. Um, and especially if there is any way that they can actually go and get a neuropsych eval or get some support, that may be a better road to take than to just, for example, like self-diagnose from watching TikTok. Again, not to completely invalidate that experience, because I know and trust people who really have found really important support from self-diagnosis. But I think when we're talking about a minor, a young person who might really take different actions in life because of a diagnosis that they develop themselves, right? It's important to get some kind of vetting and reality check going on and even just to bring them into dialogue with other people. Again, ideally in person. Online has a lot of amazing resources, and it's also good to see what we can do for young people in person. That's why libraries are so amazing, right? We want to be mentoring kids and not just monitoring. There's been such a push toward monitoring young people and controlling young people. Um, I have so much to say about this, but I don't want to like push the envelope too far. I guess what I'll say though is that I would look at any attempts to keep young people off the internet and think about what that means when we're talking about young activists in movements like Me Too, in Black Lives Matter, in other social and political movements. Historically, we've seen young people involved in social and political movements before they were 16 years old, taking sometimes really frontline roles. Think about the March for Our Lives and other social movements in the United States and around the world. I think any move to keep young people offline until they're 16 can be seen as kind of silencing, right? And so we really need to think about, is there a different way we can protect young people whose mental health is important? And there are a lot of toxic and problematic things. I'm not saying everything on the internet is something I would want my own kid or anybody's kid to interact with. But one of the questions I have is, how can we make online spaces better for everyone and therefore better and safer for young people, as opposed to focusing on keeping young people out of these spaces completely, right? So how can, because young people are really desirous, this is an image of a peer-to-peer dating advice channel from TikTok, right? Young people want to hear from other young people. They want to be in the conversation. How can we help them do that in a way that's safe, in a way that's developmentally appropriate? How can we help them deal with the problems that do come up, whether it's something like sexually harassing direct messages on Instagram, problematic things shared by peers or people they don't know, comments on their own content. Like if you have a young person who has a YouTube channel or has TikTok or is putting themselves out there in a public way, what if they're receiving, hateful or unkind comments? How can we support them through that? When we see kids in the library gaming or working in together, how can we give them tools to navigate conflict resolution? What are the things that one of the things that we've heard a lot from educators and librarians and other, and parents in the last 5 years is that the pandemic really curtailed some in-person hangout opportunities that may have given kids less practice. So what can we do to make sure that young people have the opportunity to practice conflict resolution and to do it in a respectful and thoughtful way, right? Kids are often very clueless about even the most basic things like texting. So if you have a remind app for something you're doing in the library, or if you are on a Slack or Discord server with young people, what are the opportunities to gently give feedback to make sure that they're communicating in ways that are safe and appropriate? One of the unique things about a library setting is often we're in a situation where we are more of a mentor than a supervisor, where we're in a less kind of director role and more in a mentor role. And maybe the young people who are with us are maybe there by choice. And so there's a real opportunity to do guidance there that's not about like, you messed up, you're in trouble, but just like, hey, it would be more effective, or have you thought about, right? And that is an incredible thing. And especially with the developmental stage that teens are in, is also a really important way to both be there for them and help them so that they don't go right to their professors in college or right to someone when they're applying for a job in a way that's going to really not reflect well on them, but also respect that they are growing in their autonomy, right? That maybe the best approach isn't always telling them what to do, but like being there when they ask for help to support them. I already talked about self-esteem and quantifying popularity and how we don't want kids to do that. Let me just move ahead here a little bit to some books on this topic. I want to think a little bit about some books, and I'm selfishly putting my own in here, but I also want to mention the book Behind Their Screens because it's a really, really great book that also really centers the voices of young people and is using research in a really thoughtful way. Emily Weinstein and Carrie James wrote this book. It came out in 2022, so it's still relatively current. And they're continuing to do research. And the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where they both are, is another space that I would keep an eye on for research on these topics and others related to young people. Um, this is a really, really thoughtful book. My book is very advicey. I would say Behind Their Screens is a little more open-ended and kind of really just focused on the research, which is really great. And again, you really learn about young people and their practices. I wrote a article based about their book and about Heartstopper, the British series, which is now, I think, on its third season or just finished its third season, based on the UK graphic novels. And one of the things you see if any of you are Heartstopper fans is how much they hang on one another's texts and how much the time of waiting for a text response, especially in a new romantic relationship or a new friendship, is incredibly nerve-wracking. And this is true for adults too, but I think we see in a really poignant way, both in the series, in the comic series, and on the show, some of the ways that texting is very, very intensely felt. And Behind Their Screens really got into some of that. So I was really impressed with the level of detail about the conversations. Um, I'm a critic and a skeptic about the anxious generation, to put it out there, but I think it's an incredibly powerful book. You probably have long waiting lists at your libraries to get the book. And the most important thing that the book is doing, I think, is just increasing the conversations around the impact of technology and maybe around the ways adults are using technology around young people as well. So I won't, burden you with a long list of all the critiques of the book that have been published, because they're all out there and easy to find. But I think the conversation is really vibrant right now, and anything you can do to get young people involved in the conversation, hey, this is what people are saying about you all, to get parents involved in the conversation, right? I think that's really important right now, because there's so much misunderstanding and even mistrust around young people and technology, and a lot of people reaching for community-wide solutions, some of which feel very controlling and limiting, and again, not coming from a place of mentorship and not necessarily a place of introspection around the ways adults are using tech. So I think it's really important to take advantage of that conversation, and really build in opportunities for also adults to hear from young people, for younger kids to hear from older kids. When I work with schools, I'm a big fan of having, 10th or 11th graders talk to 7th graders. What did you wish you knew? Sometimes having 8th graders talk to 6th graders, right? What do you wish you had known before you started, a certain app? What do you wish you knew before you got a phone? What do you wish you did differently on group texts before you ever did one, right? These are great conversations to have. And then I did want to mention Accountable. If you read nothing else on this topic, this is an incredible book. I'm sure many, many of you have read it and done book groups with it already. But I think Dashka Slater, also the author of 57 Bus, which is a really important book as well, just did a really good job investigating a story that's a very painful story of a racist incident that happened on Instagram, where there were a group of kids with a secret account, right? And of course, the title Accountable is so brilliant, because of course we need to be accountable for what we do online, but it was also an account, an Instagram account. And then Slater is telling us this account of what happened, right? So it's like a brilliant title. But just looking at what the harm really was, not just to the people who are initially targeted, but to that whole community. And by the way, I've been to Albany, California, and they are still affected by this event, which really, the public parts of the event happened in 2017, right? So we're talking about an event that is still impacting that community. And we see events like this happen, not necessarily all of them getting this amount of media attention, but we see events even in the past week, right, in the wake of the election and other things happening that are really harmful. And so it's so important that when we read this book with kids, we take care of the kids, by the way, because it may be really hard for a hard read for some of them. and that we give kids ideas and strategies. We don't want to leave people on a bummer. We don't want to leave people in a bad place where they just feel like, victimization is inevitable or there's nowhere to turn, even though this is not necessarily a happy story, right? The school district did not do a great job. Like, I hope that's not too much of a spoiler to say when you read accountable, you will not think like, oh yes, if this is the template we would follow if something like this happened here. It is like a template of like what not to do in a lot of ways. But it's so important to think about what we can leave young people with, what are the tools that we can offer them, and how can we help them understand the ways their actions have impact. Changing the narrative is change the narrative, how to foster an anti-racist culture in your school by Henry Turner and Kathy Lopez. They're folks that I interviewed for Growing Up in Public. And I know some of you are in schools and some of you are in public libraries, but it's important to um, look at what folks are doing in institutions to think about the culture. And again, this was um, some of what Turner and Lopez are writing about are in response to incidents that happened. And they're based, by the way, in Newton, Massachusetts, as some of you may know them, have seen them speak, et cetera. They're definitely deep in the New England experience. And I think, like Albany, California, Newton, Massachusetts is probably not, when people think like racist incident in their minds, it's not Albany, California near Berkeley and in the Bay Area. It's not Newton, Massachusetts. And so I think these stories and accounts of it sort of happening in places where we think that people hold very strongly to anti-racism as their public identity is really important. I just want to share this because I spoke at YALSA last year and a wonderful librarian, Billy Joe Kaufman, made this incredible sketch note, which I have permission to share with you all. And this kind of summarizes some of the things that I've been talking about, especially milestones of growing up in the digital age and, what can we do as adults who care about young people to help young people come of age and take advantage of these incredible resources of community and communication and creativity without, amplifying some of the harms that can also come with access to these powerful social tools. So I would love to turn it over to a conversation with you all, question and answer, and I will do this so I can see the chat. There we go. Okay.
Put questions into the Q&A as well.
Okay. And let me see if I can see the Q&A.
Are you able to see it, Devorah?
I see show webinar. I'm just looking if is there another panel? What I see is just the top bar. I'm just looking to see if there's like another bar hidden by some of my windows.
Can you see the chat?
Yes, I do see the chat.
Okay. Oh, okay. So we do have a question. Just curious about a few thoughts that you have about kids growing up with AI. I personally really like using it as a tool, but there's still so much to know. I personally don't have children, so not sure how kids are being encouraged or not to use it now.
Well, I can say that schools are very afraid of it for the most part. That certainly varies. And if there is sometimes a tech integrationist or a librarian or just a confident person, at the school, then that can change the culture a lot. But what I've seen is a lot of worry about cheating, which makes sense. And this is true also in higher ed, by the way, which, I'm still very connected to that world. And there's a lot of people in higher ed also very worried. And people who have had, really horrendous AI written work turned in that they can tell is, for many reasons. There's a lot of, so far AI has a ton of footprint. So in other words, like if you're going to write a, 3 or 5 page paper with AI, it's going to look like it was written by AI. And especially if you're in middle school or in high school and you're not skilled at rewriting it, not going to sound like you wrote it. It's not going to sound like a 13 or a 15-year-old wrote it. And it's also not going to sound like a very fluid thinking adult wrote it, right? It's just going to sound like AI wrote it. That may change at some point. And certainly I think we've all probably gotten a one-sentence email that AI wrote where we didn't know, or we've read social media posts that may have been partly AI written or blog posts. So I think AI is getting better in that way, but schools are really nervous about it. And then they're missing an opportunity to teach teachers in a different way. So some of the places where I've heard some really good thinking about AI, it's not my close area of expertise, but I have talked to kids about it. Um, but out of, for example, like in the Stanford Department of Education, my friend and colleague Sarah Levine, who's a literacy expert there, has written some really interesting things and gone on some podcasts to talk about it. I think people who are interested in education, who are excited about the opportunity of how can we teach with AI, are playing with it and innovating with it and giving young people a chance to experiment with it to see what it can do and to understand the limits of it. And I think that's where the opportunity lies. I also think it's important to, as an author, I just want to say, like, knowing that AI is training on authors' work, I think it's important to talk about IP. I mean, many of you are librarians and also either authors yourselves or are here because you love books. And this is like what you care about. And I think we do have to say, like, as authors, as artists, as creative people, like, it's not okay for them to just train on our stuff and not compensate us in any way or acknowledge us in any way. So I think that those moral and ethical questions and economic questions have to be looked at. But with kids, I think the opportunity is experimenting, figuring out what it can and can't do. Yeah, so kids saying what, will kids be able to distinguish? I think there's tremendous issues with news media literacy, even without AI, and understanding sources. And there's so many reasons for that, of course. I still remember my ninth grade English teacher assigning us to go to the public library and to use basically every research, learn how to use basically every research material, learn how to look something up on microfilm, and I'm, like I'm the microfilm generation. Like I've spent a lot of time, my first book, Black Power TV, I spent half a year at the Schomburg in New York, looking at things on microfilm. So those experiences are very different than the way young people use Google and other search now. And I think we do have to make sure kids know that algorithms are involved in deciding for you what you see when you search in a different way, and your priorities might be different than what the algorithm thinks you want. Um, so those kinds of big design questions are really important. Even for a young person who's just seeing things that are gross or problematic on their social media feed, like how can we help young people reset their algorithm? And I have questions for big tech about how can we make algorithms less predatory, less problematic from a privacy perspective. That again, some like the New York laws are pushing back for young people. I would like to be protected from that content as well. So is there a way without, going to full censorship, right? But how can we say like, hey, I don't want to be getting harassing direct messages? And I don't have the answer. But the ALA, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, there's a lot of folks out there trying to figure these questions out, and it's just worth being in a conversation. I think the question of protecting kids and content is a really fraught question. And it's right now, I think, being used to try to bring people together. And unfortunately, I don't think it can bring people together because there are big questions about what we want to protect kids from, right? And so there are folks who want to protect kids from information about healthcare. There are people who want to protect kids from, environmental destruction. There's very different agendas. And so I'm always really, when I hear protect the children, my ears kind of prick up because that's often being used to further a different agenda than we might imagine. And so it's just really important to kind of stay in the conversation, stay curious, and have young people in these conversations. They don't want to be talked about. They don't want to be, just kind of thrown under the bus of this generation is that, or this they really resist those generalizations about themselves.
Okay, we have quite a few other questions. There is an adult lead group in our town trying to get our library to run a parent and grandparent focused book group of anxious generation. Any advice on how to pivot the conversation to be more teen focused without coming across as a critic?
I think that's a great question. I mean, I think if you can make it just about young people in the digital age and read a range of articles, um, I mean, I think it's important to engage with Haight's work because, or Height, I think, because it's been read by so many people, but there's very few young people's voices in it. So even if you just want to say that, just say, hey, there's not really any direct conversations with young people in this book. Can we also, look at some things that young people have said, even things that young people have written? There are teenagers with podcasts on this topic that you can listen to. So just kind of thinking about where are voices we can hear nationally and internationally from young people? What are voices of kids in our own community? What do people have to say about this topic? Um, yeah, I mean that the anxious generation also has some pretty powerful a pretty powerful strategy around gender that young people may take issue with. So even if you don't want to make young people read all of, because that is a really, I mean, you said accountable, someone was saying accountable is long, like the anxious generation is quite a long read. And I don't know how many young readers necessarily would get through all of it, but like diving into some of those questions of like, okay, here's what the author is saying about boys versus girls. Like, what do we think about that? Or just like pulling out some of the kind of bigger pieces would be interesting. And I think also figuring out, regardless of what you read, I mean, if you don't have community members read Height or my book or Behind Their Screens, even just reading some articles, which may be more realistic for a lot of parents these days, what can they do? What can they actually do? Like, because there's a lot of books that will just tell you young people are wrecked, but there's no solution there. It's like, well, what can we do to help young people feel like they matter, feel like they have a voice, feel like they're connected with others? And I think that's a really important question.
Thank you. The next one is wondering if you have any creative ideas on how to subtly teach media and digital literacy skills to teens in the library. A more structured lecture style program doesn't fit the needs of my patrons, but I've definitely noticed that they don't have those literacy skills. Any suggestions?
When young people get to be journalists, that's a really great way. So you may not be able to do an ongoing paper or radio show, but maybe they can, create like 1 hour of news programming that goes up on YouTube or on the library webpage. Anything that where they have to report and be held to a standard of what's reportable. Like we can't report hearsay. We can't report my best friend's cousin says that there's vaping in the bathroom at the high school, so therefore I'm going to write an article and say kids are vaping in the bathroom. Like I need to like go to the bathroom and see if kids are vaping. I need to interview a bunch of kids. I need to figure out, like, is this really happening? What's the story? What do we know? And be held to account by an editor who might send me back for more information or might say, is that quote, can you prove that that person really said that? Um, and that's a really great way to go. And then just having, I mean, I don't know I'm sure you all still get digital, physical magazines and papers. In our house, we still read Sunday papers. I'm also married to a journalist, so I recognize that I'm living with some people who are very journalism oriented, but we read the Sunday Times with our kid. But I wonder if you could have like a Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon club if your library isn't open on Sunday morning. But actually sitting around and reading the paper or doing something old school like that could be really fun. Might for some kids be the first time that they're seeing their news not in a stream based on their interests and based on an algorithm, but just based on what an editorial board decided should be on the front page or the front page of different sections. And that's a very different way to get news. That may be too antiquated for a lot of people, though.
Okay, so the next thing is not really a question. She says, not a question, just my 2 cents. I like to think about AI in the same sphere as calculators. There was a lot of uncertainty in a similar way regarding doing work for students, but they can be a great tool. I've noticed that a lot of the teens say, oh, you're using AI if they see that I'm employing it as a tool at work. So I do feel like they get a lot of negative feedback about it elsewhere in their lives, though I can definitely understand the concerns about it.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is worth figuring out what it can do for us as a tool. And I think we're just at, again, the very beginning of that.
I agree. I agree. We have a few more minutes if anybody wants to put in any other questions. There is something in the chat that says the book Digital Detectives has a cool handout and discussion questions. Maybe make a monthly display from there.
Yeah, I think that anything we can do to help young people, I'm going to bring back my first slide so you can find it if you want to. I'm also on Substack though, too. I'm kind of moving into more of a Substack and maybe less social media. But if you want to join my email list, you can text screens to 66866. I am on Instagram. And then for those who read the book, if you want to throw up an online review, I would be grateful. I do think that there are a number of us, and I wouldn't say just Emily and Carrie, but another really great Substack is Jacqueline Nessie, who is a Connecticut-based person. So she's there in New England. She's really great. Actually, Emily and Carrie are also in New England. These are folks who are really trying to not just panic and really looking at the questions of what can we learn from research? And a lot of the research isn't great. A lot of the research doesn't tell us what we want to know about young people. So I would also trust your own experiences. You know, if you run a Minecraft group and you see that there's a lot of opportunity for kids mentoring each other. And by the way, when kids teach each other video games, they're learning teaching and learning skills. They're learning how to mentor one another. They're learning conflict resolution skills. I mean, these are amazing things to happen. I think you can trust your instinct about whether this has a positive role in their lives or not, right? And so I think there is this kind of techno panic going on right now where you might think, oh, can I do a gaming group or can I do these things? Well, when we see positive results, we can also share that with people, even if we don't have, you know, massive amounts of research. Nobody really knows everything. My cat really, really wants to be in the Zoom. Nobody really knows everything about what this will mean to young people growing up. But anytime young people are listened to, anytime they're in a community that they're supported, that's always better than if they're more isolated, if they don't have adults who can listen to them and mentor them. So we already know those things, and we're really just using these digital tools in new ways to add to, you know, what have been longstanding strategies of supporting young people in libraries for, you know, many decades now. So this is just extending our capabilities, you know. And I think that that's a really important thing to point out to parents. Like if a parent's like, I don't want my kid on the library Discord, not for a reason, but because they're like, I heard Discord is bad, or frankly, the name isn't the best branding for kids, I would say, right? Like if I was naming a product that I wanted parents to feel safe with, maybe I wouldn't have called it Discord. But anyway, that said, can we talk about what the benefits are and what the difference is between being in a verified Discord in a library versus, you know, being on open-ended, whoever Discord, right? I think that's really important. Thank you very much for the work that you all do to support young people. I really appreciate you all.
There's a number of requests to see your cat.
Oh, let's
We
see.
all like cats.
Yes, there she is.
Oh, cute.
Katara. Her name is Katara.
Oh, the
Yeah,
calico. I love them.
yeah.
Well,
Anyway,
thank you so much. This has been wonderful, and I appreciate all the work you do.
thank you. Have an amazing day, everyone. Take care.